Captain Marcus Blackwood had served the crown for 15 years without question. His sword had drawn blood for king and country across 3 different wars. His loyalty was carved in stone, tested by fire, and proven beyond doubt. But, as he stood in the throne room that gray morning, reading the sealed orders that had just been placed in his hands, something cold settled in his stomach. "You look troubled, Captain." King Edmund's voice carried across the marble floor like winter wind. The monarch sat hunched forward on his throne, fingers drumming against the golden armrest. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually pristine beard showed days of neglect. Marcus cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, these orders, they concern Lord Ashworth's estate." "Indeed they do." The king's jaw tightened. "Is there a problem with following royal commands, Captain?" "No, sire." "Never." Marcus folded the parchment carefully. "When shall we proceed?" "Tonight." Under cover of darkness. King Edmund rose from his throne, his royal robes rustling like autumn leaves. "And, Captain? This mission requires absolute discretion. No word of this reaches anyone outside your most trusted men." Marcus bowed deeply. "It will be done, Your Majesty." As he left the throne room, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Lord Ashworth had been the king's closest friend since childhood. They'd grown up together, trained together, even fought side by side in the border wars. What could possibly justify a midnight raid on his private manor? The captain made his way through the castle's winding corridors, past tapestries depicting glorious battles and portraits of long-dead kings. Servants scurried about their duties, heads bowed, whispering among themselves. The entire castle felt different lately. Tense. Fearful. As if everyone was waiting for something terrible to happen. Marcus found his lieutenant, Thomas Gray, in the armory, inspecting weapons and counting supplies. Thomas was young but reliable, with steady hands and a sharp mind that had saved their unit more than once. "Tom, gather 8 of our best men. Full armor, but darkened. No reflective surfaces." Thomas looked up from the sword he was examining. "Night patrol, sir?" "Something like that." Marcus studied his young lieutenant's face. "Can I trust you completely, Tom?" "With your life, sir." "You know that." "Good. Because what we're about to do, it may test that trust." Within hours, Marcus had assembled his team. 8 soldiers, all veterans, all men he'd served with for years. They met in the castle's lower courtyard as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains. The air smelled of coming rain, and storm clouds gathered overhead like dark omens. "We're raiding Lord Ashworth's manor," Marcus announced without ceremony. "By direct order of the king." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. These men knew Lord Ashworth. They'd seen him at court, watched him joke with the king, witnessed his generous donations to the soldiers' families. He was beloved by everyone who knew him. Sergeant William Price, a grizzled veteran with more scars than skin, spoke first. "What's the charge, sir?" Marcus hesitated. The sealed orders had been vague. Suspiciously vague. "Treason," he finally said. Another long silence. Lightning flickered in the distance, and thunder rumbled like an angry god. "Treason?" Price's voice was barely above a whisper. "Lord Ashworth?" "Those are our orders." Marcus's voice carried an authority he didn't feel. "We leave within the hour." Lord Ashworth's manor sat 3 miles outside the capital, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient oak trees. It was a beautiful estate, built from local stone and timber, with gardens that were famous throughout the kingdom. As Marcus and his men approached through the darkness, the manor looked peaceful and innocent, like something from a fairy tale. "No lights in the windows," Thomas observed, crouched beside Marcus behind a low stone wall. "Lord Ashworth retired early tonight." Marcus had checked. The Lord's servants had been dismissed for the evening, sent to visit family in the nearby village. "Convenient. Almost too convenient." "Feels like a trap," muttered Price. Marcus had the same feeling. Everything about this mission felt wrong. But orders were orders, and the crown's will was absolute. Remember, he whispered to his men, we're looking for evidence of treason. Documents, letters, anything that suggests betrayal of the kingdom. We search thoroughly but quietly. No unnecessary destruction. The manor's main door was locked, but Thomas made quick work of it with his lockpicks. Inside, the house was dark and silent. Their footsteps echoed softly on polished wooden floors as they spread out according to plan. Marcus headed straight for Lord Ashworth's study, the most likely place to find incriminating documents. The room smelled of leather and old books, pipe tobacco and expensive brandy. Moonlight filtered through tall windows, casting strange shadows across the walls. The captain began searching methodically. Desk drawers, filing cabinets, hidden compartments behind paintings. Nothing seemed out of place. Lord Ashworth's correspondence was exactly what you'd expect from a wealthy nobleman: business dealings, social invitations, letters from relatives. But then, Marcus found something odd. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard under the great oak desk was a small iron box. It was locked, but Thomas's skills made quick work of that too. Inside were documents that made Marcus's blood run cold. Letters. Dozens of them. All in the king's own handwriting. Marcus read the first one by candlelight, his hands beginning to shake. It was dated 3 months ago, addressed to Lord Ashworth, and it contained information about troop movements, supply routes, and defensive positions along the northern border. Military secrets that could devastate the kingdom if they fell into enemy hands. The second letter was worse. It detailed plans for a new tax on the peasants, a tax so harsh it would likely cause widespread starvation. The king was asking Lord Ashworth's advice on how to implement it without causing open rebellion. The third letter made Marcus sick to his stomach. It was about a planned massacre of prisoners of war. The king wanted Lord Ashworth's opinion on whether it would be politically expedient to execute captured enemy soldiers rather than follow the ancient laws of war. "Sir?" Thomas's voice came from the doorway. "You need to see this." Marcus followed his lieutenant to Lord Ashworth's private chambers. There, hidden behind a false wall, was a small room that Marcus had never known existed. Inside were more documents, maps, and something that chilled him to the bone. Gold. Chests full of it. Stamped with the royal seal. Blood money, Price said quietly, having joined them. Payment for keeping quiet. But Marcus was staring at something else. A letter, this one in Lord Ashworth's own hand, addressed to someone called the Northern Alliance. In it, Lord Ashworth detailed the king's military plans, his tax schemes, and his plans for the prisoners. But he wasn't selling the information. He was trying to stop it. The letter revealed that Lord Ashworth had been secretly working with the kingdom's enemies not to betray his country, but to prevent a war that would destroy thousands of innocent lives. The king had been planning to attack the northern territories without provocation, simply to expand his lands and fill his treasury. Lord Ashworth had been trying to broker peace. "Good God," Thomas whispered, reading over Marcus's shoulder. "He's not the traitor." "No," Marcus said quietly. "He's not." The sound of horses approaching made them all freeze. Through the window, Marcus could see torches moving up the manor's long driveway. A lot of torches. "Company," Price hissed. Marcus quickly gathered the most important documents and stuffed them inside his armor. Whatever was happening here, these papers were the key to understanding it. "Back door," he ordered. Quickly and quietly. But, as they moved through the manor's corridors, Marcus heard voices at the rear entrance as well. They were surrounded. "The cellar," Thomas suggested. "There might be another way out." They made their way down narrow stone steps into the manor's basement. It was dark and damp, filled with wine barrels and stored supplies. But Thomas was right, there was an old tunnel, probably built during the last civil war as an escape route. As they prepared to enter the tunnel, Marcus heard footsteps above. Heavy boots on wooden floors. Whoever had surrounded the manor was inside now, searching just as they had been. "Move," Marcus whispered. The tunnel was narrow and pitch black. They crawled through it for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When they finally emerged, they were in the woods nearly half a mile from the manor. Behind them, the sky was orange with firelight. Lord Ashworth's manor was burning. "They're destroying the evidence," Price said grimly. Marcus watched the flames consume the beautiful estate and felt something break inside his chest. Lord Ashworth wasn't a traitor. He was a hero trying to prevent a war, trying to save lives, trying to stop his king from becoming a monster. And Marcus had helped set him up. "Sir," Thomas said quietly, "what do we do now?" Marcus looked at his men, good soldiers, loyal men, men who trusted him to lead them down the right path. The documents hidden in his armor felt heavy as stones. In them was proof of the king's true plans, proof of Lord Ashworth's innocence, proof that everything they'd been taught about honor and duty was a lie. Now, Marcus stared at the burning manor, at the destruction of an innocent man's life. "Now we decide what kind of men we really are." Thunder crashed overhead, and the rain finally began to fall. But it wasn't enough to wash away the flames. It wasn't enough to wash away the truth. And it definitely wasn't enough to wash away the choice that Marcus and his men now faced. The crown they'd served so faithfully had become corrupted. The king they'd sworn to protect was planning atrocities that would stain the kingdom's honor forever. And the man they'd been sent to destroy was the only one trying to stop it. As they watched Lord Ashworth's home burn, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. But he didn't yet know if it would save the kingdom or destroy it completely. The rain fell harder, turning the ash to mud, but the fire burned on. And, in the darkness of that terrible night, 8 soldiers discovered that sometimes the most loyal thing you can do is betray everything you once believed in. The real question was, what would they do with that knowledge? And how many people would die before they figured out the answer? 3 days after the manor burned, Marcus and his men returned to the castle as heroes. The official story was simple: they had uncovered Lord Ashworth's treasonous correspondence with enemy forces and destroyed the evidence along with his estate. The king himself praised their loyalty and efficiency. Marcus stood at attention in the throne room, accepting royal commendation while the documents that proved the king's crimes pressed against his ribs like guilty secrets. Around him, his men maintained perfect military bearing, but he could see the strain in their faces. They all knew the truth now. They all carried the weight of it. "Captain Blackwood," King Edmund announced to the assembled court, "your swift action has saved the kingdom from a dangerous betrayal. Lord Ashworth's attempts to sell our military secrets to the Northern Alliance have been thwarted." The courtiers applauded politely. Marcus noticed how many of them avoided eye contact, how their smiles seemed forced. Did they know something was wrong? Or were they simply afraid, as everyone in the castle seemed to be these days? "Thank you, Your Majesty," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "As a reward for your service, you and your men will receive triple pay for the month. And, Captain, I have a special assignment for you." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Your Majesty?" "The Northern Alliance has been requesting peace negotiations. They claim to want an end to the border skirmishes." The king's smile was cold as winter steel. "I want you to attend these meetings as my personal representative. Help them understand the consequences of continued aggression." It was a trap. Marcus realized that immediately. The king wanted him at the peace talks not to negotiate, but to ensure they failed. To perhaps even sabotage them completely. And, with Lord Ashworth gone, there was no one left to speak for peace. "It would be an honor, Your Majesty." "Excellent. The talks begin in 5 days, at Riverlands Keep. Take your most trusted men." The king's eyes glittered with something that might have been madness. "Make sure our enemies understand the price of challenging the crown." As the formal ceremony concluded, Marcus caught sight of a familiar figure in the crowd. Lady Catherine Ashworth, Lord Ashworth's daughter, stood near the back of the throne room. She was dressed in mourning black, her face pale but composed. When their eyes met across the crowded room, Marcus felt as if she could see straight through to his soul. She knew. Somehow, she knew. After the ceremony, Marcus tried to leave quickly, but Lady Catherine intercepted him in the castle's main corridor. She was 23 years old, known throughout the court for her intelligence and strong will. Her father had been training her to manage the family estates, unusual for a woman but necessary since she was his only child. "Captain Blackwood," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Might I have a word?" Marcus glanced around. The corridor was busy with courtiers and servants, too public for dangerous conversation. "Of course, my lady. Though I'm not sure what we would have to discuss. My father's death, perhaps?" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. "Your father died in the fire at his manor. I'm sorry for your loss." "Indeed." Lady Catherine's green eyes never left his face. "How convenient that he died just as you were searching his home. And how strange that a man who never traveled at night, who always kept servants in the house, happened to be alone when the fire started." Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything, Captain. I'm simply observing that my father's death came at a very convenient time for certain people." She paused, letting the words sink in. People who might have found his recent activities inconvenient. "Your father was a traitor," Marcus said, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. Lady Catherine smiled then, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Was he? How interesting that you know this so definitively. Almost as if you found proof." Marcus realized he was being played. Lady Catherine was far more dangerous than he'd assumed. She was fishing for information, testing his knowledge, trying to understand what really happened that night. "I should go," he said. "Of course. But, Captain?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "If you ever decide you need to discuss my father's treason in more detail, you can find me in the castle's east wing. I'd been granted rooms there while I settle his affairs." As she walked away, Marcus felt as if he'd just survived his first real battle in years. Lady Catherine wasn't just grieving her father. She was planning something. That evening, Marcus gathered his men in a private room at a tavern outside the castle walls. The Rusty Anchor was known for its discreet clientele and thick walls that muffled conversation. It was where soldiers went when they needed to speak freely. "We need to talk about what we saw," Marcus began without preamble. Price took a long drink of ale before responding. "What's to talk about? We followed orders, we found evidence of treason, and we reported it." "Did we?" Thomas asked quietly. "Because from where I sat, it looked like we found evidence that Lord Ashworth was trying to prevent a war, not start one." "Careful, lad," Price warned. "That kind of talk can get you hanged." "So can staying silent while innocent people are murdered," Thomas shot back. Marcus held up a hand for silence. "Everyone here saw the same documents I did. Everyone here knows what they really said. The question is, what do we do about it?" The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. These were good men, loyal soldiers who had never questioned orders before. But they had families, people they cared about, reasons to stay alive. "The king's planning to attack the Northern Alliance," said Corporal James Winters, a quiet man who rarely spoke but always listened. "Those documents made it clear. He wants to start a war just to expand his territory. And tax the people to starvation to pay for it," added Private Mark Stone. "And execute prisoners instead of following the rules of war," Thomas said grimly. Marcus looked around the table at these men who had followed him through hell and back. "I won't order anyone to do anything. But I'm going to those peace talks, and I'm going to find a way to prevent this war. Even if it means disobeying the king's orders." "That's treason," Price said softly. "Is it? Or is staying silent while innocent people die the real treason?" One by one, his men nodded their agreement. Even Price, after a long moment, raised his mug in a silent toast. "To doing what's right," Marcus said, "even when it's not what we're told." The next morning, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Lady Catherine appeared at his quarters before dawn, dressed as a servant and carrying a basket of laundry. It was a clever disguise. Servants were invisible in the castle, able to go anywhere without question. "We need to talk," she said simply. Marcus let her in, checking the corridor first to make sure they weren't observed. His quarters were small but private, with a window overlooking the castle courtyard. "You found something in my father's study," she said, setting down the laundry basket. "I can see it in your eyes. You know he wasn't a traitor." Marcus studied her face. Lady Catherine had her father's intelligence but her late mother's steel. She wouldn't give up easily. "What do you want?" he asked. "Justice. Revenge. Truth. Pick whichever motivates you most." She sat down uninvited, arranging her skirts carefully. "My father spent months trying to prevent this war. He knew the king was planning something terrible, so he made contact with the Northern Alliance to try to broker peace. That's still treason, technically. Is it treason to save lives? Is it treason to prevent a massacre?" Her voice rose slightly, then she controlled herself. "My father wasn't selling secrets to help an enemy. He was sharing information to prevent unnecessary bloodshed." Marcus walked to the window, staring out at the castle walls. "Even if that's true, it doesn't matter now. He's dead, and the king is moving forward with his plans. Unless someone stops him." "Someone like who? A disgraced captain? A grieving daughter? We have no power, no influence, no army." Lady Catherine smiled then, and, for the first time it reached her eyes. "Don't we? Captain, you're being sent to the peace talks. You'll have access to the Northern Alliance representatives. And I know things about this kingdom, about the king's plans, that could be very valuable to the right people." Marcus turned back to face her. "You want me to commit actual treason. I want you to prevent a war that will kill thousands of innocent people. Call it whatever you like. And, if we're caught? Then, we'll die knowing we tried to do the right thing. Can you say the same if we do nothing?" Marcus found himself thinking about the documents hidden in his quarters, the proof of the king's crimes. He thought about Lord Ashworth, trying to save lives even at the cost of his own reputation. He thought about the soldiers who would die in an unnecessary war, the peasants who would starve under impossible taxes, the prisoners who would be executed in violation of every law of honor and decency. "What exactly are you proposing?" Lady Catherine opened her laundry basket and pulled out several documents. "My father kept copies of everything. Letters from the king, military plans, tax schemes, everything. I have proof of what the king really intends." Marcus recognized some of the documents from Lord Ashworth's study. "You saved these from the fire?" "I was never at the manor that night. I've been staying in the capital for weeks, attending court functions. These documents were hidden in a safe house my father established months ago, as insurance." She spread the papers on Marcus's table. "This is evidence that could bring down the king, if presented to the right people at the right time. The Northern Alliance. Among others. There are lords in this kingdom who are growing tired of the king's madness. Military commanders who don't want to fight an unjust war. Common people who are already struggling under the current taxes." Marcus stared at the documents. They represented a chance to prevent a catastrophe, but also a guarantee of death if they were discovered. "This is bigger than just stopping a war. This is rebellion." "Yes," Lady Catherine said simply. "It is." Outside, the morning bells were ringing, calling the castle to another day of normal life. But Marcus knew that nothing would ever be normal again. He was being asked to choose between his oath to the crown and his oath to justice. Between the king he had served loyally and the kingdom he truly loved. "I need time to think," he said finally. Lady Catherine began putting the documents back in her basket. "Time is the one thing we don't have. The peace talks begin in 4 days. Once they fail, once the king gets his war, there will be no stopping what comes next." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "My father died believing that good men would do the right thing when it mattered most. He believed in people like you, Captain Blackwood. Don't let his faith be misplaced." After she left, Marcus sat alone in his quarters, staring at the place where the documents had been spread. Outside his window, the castle went about its business. Guards walked their patrols, servants hurried through courtyards, nobles conducted their affairs. Everyone following orders, following routine, following the natural flow of power and authority. But, sometimes, Marcus realized, the natural flow led to a waterfall. And, sometimes the most loyal thing a man could do was refuse to go over the edge. The question was, did he have the courage to swim against the current? And, if he did, would anyone follow him? The answers would come soon enough. In 4 days, at Riverlands Keep, Captain Marcus Blackwood would have to decide whether he was a loyal soldier or a good man. He was beginning to suspect he couldn't be both. The Gathering Storm. Riverlands Keep sat on the border between the kingdom and the Northern Alliance territories, a massive stone fortress that had changed hands 7 times during the last century of wars. Now it served as neutral ground for diplomatic meetings, its great hall decorated with banners from both sides hanging in careful equality. Marcus arrived with his men 2 days early, ostensibly to inspect security arrangements but actually to meet secretly with the Northern Alliance representatives. The leader of their delegation was Commander Elena Vasquez, a woman whose reputation for both military skill and diplomatic cunning was legendary on both sides of the border. She was younger than Marcus had expected, perhaps 35, with prematurely gray hair and scars that spoke of real combat experience. Her delegation included 2 other military commanders, a diplomat, and, to Marcus's surprise, a priest of the Old Faith. Captain Blackwood, Commander Vasquez said when they met in a private chamber beneath the keep. Lady Catherine's letter said you had urgent information to share. Marcus had received Lady Catherine's coded message the day before leaving the capital. She had somehow managed to make contact with the Northern Alliance directly, using channels her father had established months earlier. The conspiracy was wider and deeper than Marcus had imagined. Before we begin, Marcus said carefully, I need to know something. Is the Northern Alliance truly interested in peace, or are you simply buying time to prepare for war? Vasquez smiled grimly. Captain, my people have been fighting border skirmishes with your kingdom for 5 years. We've lost hundreds of good soldiers and civilians. The last thing we want is to escalate this conflict into full war. Then, why the military buildup? Our scouts report increased troop movements along the border. Because we know what your king is planning. She gestured to the priest, an elderly man with kind eyes and work-worn hands. Father Miguel has contacts throughout your kingdom. Common people, mostly farmers, merchants, craftsmen. They see the preparations for war, the new taxes being collected, the grain being stockpiled for military campaigns. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. Of course the king's war preparations would be visible to ordinary citizens. You couldn't mobilize an army in secret. What exactly do you know? He asked. Commander Vasquez spread a map across the rough wooden table. Your king plans to attack our settlements along the river valleys within 6 weeks. The official justification will be retaliation for alleged raids on your border towns, raids that haven't happened yet but will be staged by your own forces. The casual way she described the king's deception made Marcus's stomach turn. How can you be so certain? Because Lord Ashworth warned us. Before his unfortunate death in that convenient fire. Her eyes met Marcus's steadily. He was a good man trying to prevent a massacre. I assume you know this, or you wouldn't be here. Marcus realized there was no point in pretense. Lady Catherine had clearly told them everything. Yes. I know. Good. Then, you'll understand why we need to act quickly. Vasquez pointed to several locations on the map. The king's plan calls for simultaneous attacks here, here, and here. 3 farming communities with a combined population of about 8,000 people. Men, women, children all to be killed or driven out to make room for new settlements loyal to your crown. That's not war, Marcus said quietly. That's genocide. Yes. And, once it begins, my government will have no choice but to respond with full military force. The conflict will spiral out of control, dragging in other kingdoms, other alliances. We could be looking at the largest war this continent has seen in 2 centuries. Marcus studied the map, seeing not strategic positions but villages full of families, farms where children played, markets where people bought bread and gossiped about their neighbors. All of it would be swept away by the king's ambition. What do you propose? Several things, working together. Vasquez rolled up the map and pulled out another set of documents. First, we need to expose the king's plans to his own people. Most of your kingdom's citizens don't want this war, they can't afford it, and they don't understand why it's necessary. The king controls the information. He'll simply claim it's enemy propaganda. Which is why we need credible sources. Military officers, nobles, people with access to the truth. She looked at Marcus meaningfully. People like you. I'm one captain with 8 men. Hardly enough to start a revolution. Revolutions don't start with armies, Captain. They start with individuals making difficult choices. The priest spoke for the first time, his voice gentle but firm. Your Lord Ashworth understood this. He knew that one man with the courage to speak truth could change everything. Marcus thought about Lady Catherine, alone in the capital, surrounded by enemies but still fighting for justice. What else? We need to prove that the border raids are false flag operations. Vasquez pulled out detailed sketches of military uniforms and equipment. Lord Ashworth provided these before his death. They show how your soldiers will be disguised to look like our raiders when they attack your own border towns. The level of planning was staggering. The king had thought of everything, prepared for every contingency. Except, perhaps, for loyal soldiers developing consciences. And, third? We need to make contact with sympathetic elements within your kingdom. Lords who oppose the war, military commanders who won't follow illegal orders, religious leaders who can speak to the people's consciences. Vasquez paused. Lady Catherine believes such people exist. Marcus nodded slowly. He'd heard whispers in the castle, seen the worried faces of courtiers, noticed which nobles avoided eye contact when the king spoke of military glory. They exist. But they're afraid. Fear is powerful, the priest said. But truth is more powerful. And justice most powerful of all. They spent the next several hours going over details. Marcus would return to the capital with intelligence about the Northern Alliance's preparations for war, information carefully designed to make the king overconfident. Meanwhile, the alliance would begin reaching out to opposition elements within the kingdom, using Lord Ashworth's old network of contacts. The real peace negotiations would be a sham, designed to fail spectacularly so the king would have his justification for war. But, hidden within that failure would be the seeds of the king's downfall. There's one more thing, Commander Vasquez said as their meeting concluded. Lady Catherine asked me to give you this. She handed Marcus a sealed letter. His name was written on the outside in Lady Catherine's elegant script. Marcus read it privately after the Alliance delegation had left. Captain Blackwood, by the time you read this, I will already be implementing the next phase of our plan. I've made contact with several lords who oppose the king's policies, including Duke Harrison and Count Aldridge. They're planning to present a formal petition to the king, demanding he abandon his war plans. It won't work, of course, but it will force people to choose sides publicly. Meanwhile, I'm working to ensure that evidence of the king's crimes reaches the right people at the right time. Be careful at court when you return. The king is becoming increasingly paranoid, and anyone who was close to my father is under suspicion. Stay strong. We're closer to success than you might think. Marcus burned the letter immediately, but its contents stayed with him as he prepared for the formal peace negotiations that would begin the following day. The Great Hall of Riverlands kept filled with representatives from both sides, along with neutral observers from 3 neighboring kingdoms. The atmosphere was tense but polite, everyone playing their assigned roles in the diplomatic dance. King Edmund had not come personally, sending instead Lord Chancellor Meredith, a thin, nervous man who jumped at Shadow's End, spoke only in prepared phrases. The king clearly didn't trust anyone important enough to make real decisions. The negotiations proceeded exactly as Commander Vasquez had predicted. The Northern Alliance made reasonable offers for peace, including compensation for past damages and agreements on border security. Lord Chancellor Meredith rejected everything, making increasingly unreasonable demands. The Crown requires not just compensation, but reparations, Meredith announced on the second day. Full payment for every soldier killed in border skirmishes, every farm burned, every merchant caravan attacked. We would be happy to provide such compensation, Commander Vasquez replied smoothly, if you can provide evidence that our forces were responsible for these incidents. Meredith's face flushed red. Are you calling the Crown a liar? I'm asking for proof. Surely a kingdom as great as yours keeps detailed records of such attacks. Of course, there were no records, because most of the attacks had never happened. The few real incidents had been staged by the king's own forces. Marcus watched the Chancellor fumble for answers and felt sick. But something unexpected happened on the third day. Duke Harrison arrived at Riverlands Keep with a small escort, claiming to be there as an observer for the kingdom's northern lords. Duke Harrison was a man Marcus knew by reputation, a veteran of the border wars, respected for his military skill and fair treatment of his people. He was also, according to Lady Catherine's letter, one of the lords opposing the king's war plans. Lord Chancellor, Duke Harrison said during a break in negotiations, might I have a word in private? Marcus couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see Meredith's face growing paler by the minute. When they returned to the negotiating table, the Chancellor's hands were shaking. That evening, Marcus managed to arrange a brief private meeting with Duke Harrison. They met in the Keep's chapel, speaking in whispers while pretending to pray. Lady Catherine sent me, the Duke said without preamble. She believes you have information that could prevent this war. Marcus pulled out several of the documents he'd taken from Lord Ashworth's study. Proof that the king is planning to attack civilian targets. Proof that the border raids are false flag operations. Proof that this entire war is unjustified. Duke Harrison studied the papers by candlelight, his expression growing darker with each page. This is worse than I feared. We knew the king was becoming unstable, but this level of premeditation. What will you do? What I must. Return to the capital, gather the other lords who still have consciences, and present this evidence formally. He looked up at Marcus. But we'll need more than documents. We'll need witnesses. People with credibility who can testify to what they've seen. I was there when we found these papers. So were my men. Military officers testifying against their commander is treason. You understand that? Marcus had been thinking about it for days. I understand that staying silent while innocent people are murdered is also treason. Treason against everything a soldier should stand for. Duke Harrison smiled grimly. Lord Ashworth said you were a good man. I'm beginning to see why. The formal negotiations collapsed the next morning, exactly as planned. Lord Chancellor Meredith stormed out, declaring that the Northern Alliance was clearly preparing for war and that the kingdom would respond accordingly. But, as Marcus prepared to return to the capital with news of the failed peace talks, he knew that the real negotiations, the ones that might actually prevent a war, were just beginning. In his saddlebags were copies of the evidence that could bring down the king. In his head was a plan that might save thousands of lives. And, in his heart was a growing certainty that sometimes the most loyal thing a man could do was betray everything he'd been taught to believe in. The question now was whether he and his allies could move fast enough to prevent catastrophe. Because back in the capital, King Edmund was already preparing for war. And time was running out for everyone. The storm was gathering, and soon everyone would have to choose which side they were on when it finally broke. #the point of no return. Marcus returned to the capital to find it transformed. Military patrols walked the streets in groups of 6 instead of pairs. New checkpoints appeared at every major intersection. Guards questioned citizens about their business, their destinations, their loyalty to the crown. The city felt like it was under siege, though no enemy army approached its walls. The castle was even worse. Servants whispered in corners and jumped at unexpected sounds. Courtiers moved in tight groups, afraid to be caught alone with dangerous thoughts. Everyone watched everyone else, looking for signs of disloyalty, for opportunities to prove their devotion to the increasingly paranoid king. Marcus was summoned to report on the failed peace negotiations within hours of his return. He found King Edmund in the castle's war room, surrounded by maps and military advisors. The king looked older, more haggard, with new lines around his eyes and a tremor in his hands that hadn't been there a week earlier. "Captain Blackwood," the king said without looking up from his maps. "I trust the Northern Alliance showed their true colors." "They were completely unreasonable, Your Majesty. They refused every offer of compromise, made impossible demands, and showed clear signs of preparing for expanded military action." Marcus delivered the lies smoothly, hating every word. But this was the role he had to play to maintain his cover while the real plan developed. "Excellent. Then, no one can say we didn't try diplomacy." King Edmund finally looked up, and Marcus was shocked by what he saw. The king's eyes held a wild gleam that spoke of madness barely held in check. "Military preparations will proceed immediately. I want our forces ready to move within the week." "So soon, Your Majesty?" "Speed is essential, Captain. Strike before they expect it, before they can prepare proper defenses." The king's smile was cold and calculating. Fear is a powerful weapon when used correctly. As Marcus left the war room, he was intercepted by Lord Chancellor Meredith, who looked even more nervous than usual. "Captain, a word if you please." They stepped into an alcove, away from the constant flow of courtiers and soldiers. "The king is concerned about security," Meredith said carefully. "There have been reports of seditious talk among some of the nobility. Dangerous ideas about the necessity of this war." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "What sort of dangerous ideas?" "Questions about the evidence for Northern Alliance aggression. Suggestions that perhaps diplomacy hasn't been given a fair chance." Meredith's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Duke Harrison has been particularly outspoken since returning from Riverlands Keep." So the Duke was already moving, presenting the opposition case despite the risks. Marcus felt a mixture of admiration and terror. Admiration for the man's courage, terror at how quickly events were accelerating. "What does His Majesty want me to do?" "Keep your ears open. Report anything suspicious." "And, Captain?" Meredith gripped Marcus's arm with surprising strength. "Be very careful who you trust. The king sees enemies everywhere now, and he's not always wrong." That evening, Marcus met with his men at their usual tavern. The Rusty Anchor was packed with soldiers and castle workers, all talking about the coming war. The mood was strange, part excitement, part fear, part confusion. Many of the men seemed uncertain about why they were fighting, but eager to prove their courage anyway. "It's spreading," Thomas reported quietly. "The doubts about this war. I've heard sergeants questioning the orders, guards wondering why we're mobilizing so quickly. Dangerous talk," Price warned. "The kind that gets men hanged." "Maybe," said Corporal Winters. "Or maybe the kind that prevents unnecessary deaths." Marcus looked around the table at these men who had followed him through so much. They deserved to know what they were being asked to risk. "I met with Duke Harrison at Riverlands Keep," he said. "He's organizing opposition to the king's war plans. It's not just talk anymore, it's turning into real resistance." The silence stretched long and tense. Finally, Price spoke. "What kind of resistance?" "The kind that could prevent this war. Or get us all executed for treason." Thomas leaned forward. "What do you need from us?" "I need you to start talking to men you trust. Sergeants, corporals, anyone with influence among the troops. Find out how many soldiers would refuse orders to attack civilian targets." "That's mutiny," Price pointed out. "Yes," Marcus said simply. "It is." One by one, his men nodded their agreement. They were crossing a line from which there would be no return, but they were crossing it together. 2 days later, the first phase of Duke Harrison's plan began. A formal petition was presented to the king, signed by 12 of the kingdom's most prominent lords, requesting that he reconsider his decision to go to war. Marcus wasn't present for the private meeting, but the results were visible throughout the castle within hours. The king flew into a rage, accused the petitioning lords of cowardice and possible treason, and ordered increased surveillance on all of them. That night, Lady Catherine appeared at Marcus's quarters again, this time dressed as a kitchen servant. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and a tension in her movements that spoke of constant fear. "It's starting to fall apart," she said without preamble. "The king arrested Count Aldridge this morning on charges of sedition. Duke Harrison and the others have gone into hiding." Marcus felt the walls closing in around them. "What about the evidence? The documents proving the king's plans?" "Hidden, but not yet presented. We need more time to coordinate the revelation with military resistance, or it will just be dismissed as forgery." She paced nervously around his small room. "The problem is, we're running out of allies. People are too frightened to act. What about the common people? The merchants, farmers, craftsmen? They'll be the ones paying for this war with their taxes and their sons' lives." Lady Catherine stopped pacing. "That's actually why I'm here. We've had an idea, but it's dangerous. More dangerous than anything we've attempted so far." She explained the plan that she and Duke Harrison had developed. Instead of trying to work through official channels that the king controlled, they would take their case directly to the people. Market squares, town meetings, anywhere citizens gathered to hear news and discuss events. "The king can silence lords and arrest nobles," she explained. "But he can't arrest half the kingdom. If enough ordinary people understand what's really happening, they can pressure their local leaders, their military commanders, their priests. Create a groundswell of opposition that even the king can't ignore." It was brilliant and terrifying at the same time. Success could prevent the war and expose the king's crimes. Failure would mean executions for treason on a massive scale. "We'll need credible speakers," Marcus pointed out. "People the citizens will believe. We have them. Lord Ashworth's old network includes merchants, craftsmen, minor nobles, even some lower-level clergy. People with local influence and clean reputations." Lady Catherine pulled out a list of names. "But we also need military voices. Soldiers who can speak to the cost of unjust wars." Marcus understood what she was asking. "You want me to speak publicly against the king? I want you to tell the truth. About what you found in my father's study. About what the king is really planning. About what this war will cost in innocent lives." It was the ultimate test of his commitment. Marcus could work behind the scenes, could gather intelligence and pass messages, could even refuse orders when the time came. But to speak publicly against the king was to paint a target on his back that would never disappear. "If I do this, there's no going back. Win or lose, my career is over. Probably my life too." "Yes," Lady Catherine said simply. "But if you don't do this, how many other careers will be cut short? How many other lives will be lost in an unnecessary war?" Marcus thought about the villages marked for destruction on Commander Vasquez's map. Thousands of people who had never heard of Lord Ashworth or Duke Harrison or Captain Marcus Blackwood, but whose fate now depended on the choices made by strangers. "When do we start?" Lady Catherine smiled, and, for the first time since her father's death, it looked genuine. "Tomorrow night. There's a market gathering in the lower town. Perfect crowd, good acoustics, and far enough from the castle that we might finish before the guards arrive." The next evening, Marcus found himself standing in a crowded market square, surrounded by merchants closing their stalls, workers heading home after long days, families shopping for dinner. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that they stood at the center of a brewing revolution. Lady Catherine had arranged for several speakers to address the crowd. A merchant who could explain the economic costs of war. A priest who could speak to the moral issues. A former soldier who had fought in previous conflicts and knew the human price of battle. And Captain Marcus Blackwood, who would tell them the truth about their king. "Friends," the merchant began, his voice carrying clearly across the square, "we're here tonight because you deserve to know the truth about the war your king wants you to pay for." The crowd grew quiet, sensing that something important was happening. More people drifted in from side streets, drawn by curiosity and the promise of news. The merchant spoke about taxes, about the crushing debt that war would bring, about families already struggling to feed their children. The priest talked about justice, about the difference between defensive wars and wars of conquest, about the moral obligation to question authority when it demanded immoral actions. The former soldier described battles he'd fought, friends he'd lost, and the difference between fighting for your home and fighting for someone else's ambition. And then, it was Marcus's turn. He stepped forward, still wearing his captain's uniform, the symbol of royal authority. The crowd recognized the significance immediately. This wasn't just another speaker. This was someone from inside the system, someone with access to the truth. "I am Captain Marcus Blackwood of the Royal Guard," he began, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "And I'm here to tell you that your king is lying to you." The words fell into the square like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and whisper through the crowd. The war he wants to start isn't about defending our kingdom. It's about expanding his power and filling his treasury. The enemy attacks he claims to be responding to? They never happened. The evidence of Northern Alliance aggression? It doesn't exist. Marcus pulled out copies of the documents from Lord Ashworth's study. "I've seen the king's real plans. I've read his orders to stage false attacks on our own people to justify war. I've seen the lists of civilian targets, farming villages where children play and families work the land, marked for destruction." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Lord Ashworth wasn't a traitor. He was a hero who died trying to prevent this war. Duke Harrison and the other lords who oppose these plans aren't cowards. They're patriots trying to save their kingdom from a mad king's ambitions. Marcus felt the weight of the moment, the terrible freedom of finally speaking truth to power. Whatever happened now, he had done the right thing. "This war will cost you everything," he continued. "Your sons will die in foreign fields for no good reason. Your taxes will triple to pay for weapons and armies. Your kingdom will become something you no longer recognize or respect." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces, seeing fear and confusion but also growing anger. "But you have power too. You can refuse to send your sons to fight in an unjust war. You can refuse to pay taxes for a cause you don't believe in. You can demand that your local lords, your military commanders, your priests stand up for what's right." The crowd began to murmur, voices rising as people discussed what they'd heard with their neighbors. "The king rules by your consent," Marcus concluded. "If you withdraw that consent, if you stand together and say no to this madness, even kings must listen." As he stepped back, the market square erupted in conversation. Some voices were angry, some frightened, some excited. But all were engaged, all were thinking, all were beginning to understand that they had choices. Marcus had done what he came to do. He had planted seeds of truth in fertile ground. Whether they would grow into the garden of peace or be trampled underfoot by the march of war remained to be seen. But, as he slipped away into the crowd, he heard voices taking up his message, spreading it to friends and family, carrying it into every corner of the kingdom. The revolution had begun. And there was no stopping it now. #the price of truth. The response was swifter and more brutal than anyone had expected. By dawn the next morning, royal guards were conducting house-to-house searches throughout the lower town, looking for the seditious speakers who had addressed the market square gathering. 12 people were arrested, including the merchant and the priest, though Marcus and Lady Catherine managed to escape the initial sweep. Marcus found temporary shelter in a safe house that Lady Catherine had arranged, a small room above a bakery owned by one of Lord Ashworth's former contacts. The baker, a middle-aged woman named Martha, brought him bread and news from the streets. "They're saying there's a reward of 100 gold pieces for information about the soldiers who spoke against the king," Martha reported, her flour-dusted hands shaking slightly. "Half the lower town is poor enough to consider it." Marcus wasn't surprised. The king understood how to use desperation as a weapon. What about the message? Are people talking about what was said? Martha's expression brightened slightly. "Oh yes, they're talking. My customers this morning could speak of nothing else. Some are frightened, some are angry, but all of them are thinking. Word is spreading to other districts, other towns." "And the military? Any sign that soldiers are questioning their orders?" "That I don't know. But, I can tell you this, 3 of my regular customers are married to castle guards, and they all looked worried when they came in today.
Whatever's happening up there, it's got the soldiers talking among themselves.
Marcus hoped that was a good sign. His men were working to spread dissent through the ranks, but it was dangerous work. Military discipline was strong, and the penalty for mutiny was death. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Martha went downstairs to answer it, returning a few minutes later with Lady Catherine, who looked like she hadn't slept in days.
"We have problems," she said without preamble. "Big ones."
Marcus gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, pacing the small room like a caged animal.
"Duke Harrison was arrested an hour ago.
They found his hiding place. Someone betrayed him for the reward money." Her voice cracked slightly. "They also arrested his son, his brother, and 6 other lords who signed the petition." The net was closing rapidly. Marcus felt the walls of the small room pressing in around him.
"What about the other safe houses? The network your father built? Compromised."
"The king's men are following connections, interrogating prisoners, forcing people to give up names and locations." Lady Catherine finally stopped pacing, turning to face him.
"Marcus, we're losing. The resistance is being crushed before it can really begin. What about the Northern Alliance? Can they help? Commander Vasquez sent a message."
"Her forces are mobilizing, but they can't cross the border to help us without starting the very war we're trying to prevent."
"We're on our own."
Marcus moved to the small window, looking out at the narrow street below. Normal life continued despite the crisis, people walking to work, children playing, merchants setting up stalls. It all seemed so fragile now, so vulnerable to the king's madness. "There has to be something else we can try," he said finally.
"There is. But you won't like it."
Marcus turned back to face her. Lady Catherine's expression was grim but determined.
"We assassinate the king."
The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been prepared for rebellion, for defying orders, even for open warfare.
But cold-blooded murder of the monarch he'd sworn to serve? "Catherine, that's the only way to stop this."
Her voice was steady, but he could see the cost of suggesting it in her eyes.
"Every day we delay, more people die. The lords who opposed him are being executed.
The common people who listened to our message are being arrested.
Soon there won't be anyone left to resist."
Marcus sank into the room's single chair, his head in his hands.
"Even if we could get close enough to the king, even if we could succeed, what happens then? The kingdom would collapse into civil war. Different factions fighting for the throne, foreign powers invading while we're weak. It could be worse than the war we're trying to prevent." "Not necessarily."
Lady Catherine pulled out another set of documents.
"I've been in contact with Princess Elena."
Princess Elena was King Edmund's younger sister, known for her intelligence and compassion but kept away from politics by royal tradition. She lived quietly at a country estate, involved in charitable works and scholarship.
"The princess would never support regicide. She doesn't have to support it. She just has to be ready to step in when it's done."
Lady Catherine spread the papers on the small table. "These are letters from military commanders, nobles, even foreign ambassadors.
All expressing support for Princess Elena as a potential ruler.
She has the bloodline claim, the popular support, and the diplomatic connections to prevent chaos."
Marcus studied the documents.
The conspiracy was wider than he'd imagined, involving people at the highest levels of the kingdom and beyond.
"How long has this been planned?" "Months.
Even before my father's death, people were beginning to realize that King Edmund was becoming unstable. The war plans just made it urgent." Lady Catherine sat across from him.
"Marcus, I know this isn't the soldier's way.
I know you were trained to follow orders, to respect the chain of command.
But sometimes the chain becomes a noose."
Outside, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to evening prayers. Marcus wondered how many of those prayers would be for peace, and how many would go unanswered.
"How would we do it?" he asked quietly. Lady Catherine's relief was visible.
The king is becoming increasingly paranoid, but he still trusts his personal guards. You have access to him during private meetings, moments when he's alone or nearly alone.
Poison? A blade would be more certain. And, more honest, somehow.
If we're going to kill a king, we should at least have the courage to look him in the eye when we do it. Marcus thought about King Edmund as he'd last seen him, older, more haggard, with that wild gleam in his eyes. The man had been his commander for 15 years. Flawed, certainly, but once a decent ruler who genuinely cared about his kingdom.
What changed him? Marcus asked. He wasn't always like this.
Lady Catherine's expression softened slightly.
Power, I think. And fear.
The longer you hold absolute authority, the more terrifying it becomes to lose it.
Every challenge looks like rebellion, every question looks like treason.
My father watched it happening, tried to find ways to help, but the king stopped listening to anyone who disagreed with him. So we kill him to save the kingdom from him.
Yes.
And to save him from what he's becoming. That night, Marcus lay awake on the small bed above the bakery, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with the most difficult decision of his life. Everything he'd been trained for, everything he believed about duty and honor and loyalty, rebelled against the idea of killing his king. But everything he'd learned about justice and protecting the innocent demanded that he act. By morning, he'd made his choice. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A messenger arrived at the safe house before dawn with word that King Edmund wanted to see Captain Blackwood privately to discuss additional security measures for the war preparations. The meeting was scheduled for that afternoon in the king's private study, a small, intimate room with minimal guards.
Marcus spent the morning preparing.
He sharpened his dagger, the one he'd carried through 3 wars. He wrote letters to his men, explaining his actions and releasing them from any obligation to follow him into treason. He prayed for forgiveness and strength in equal measure. Lady Catherine met him one final time before he left for the castle.
"Are you certain about this?" she asked.
"No," Marcus replied honestly.
"But I'm certain about what happens if I don't do it. Princess Elena has been informed.
She's traveling to the capital now, ready to assume power as soon as news of the king's death reaches her supporters."
Lady Catherine gripped his arm. "Whatever happens, you won't have died for nothing."
Marcus made his way through the castle's familiar corridors, nodding to guards who'd served under him, passing courtiers who still saw him as a loyal captain. The normalcy of it all made the coming betrayal seem even more surreal. The king's private study was exactly as Marcus remembered: dark wood paneling, shelves lined with books and maps, a fire crackling in the stone hearth. King Edmund sat behind his desk, looking up as Marcus entered.
"Captain Blackwood. Thank you for coming."
The king gestured to a chair across from his desk. "I wanted to discuss security for the upcoming campaign. There have been concerns about loyalty among some of our officers." Marcus sat, his hand resting casually near his dagger.
"What sort of concerns, Your Majesty?"
"Reports of seditious talk. Questions about the necessity of this war, doubts about our intelligence regarding Northern Alliance activities." The king's eyes were bright with that familiar madness.
"I need to know I can trust my commanders completely." "Of course, Your Majesty."
"Good.
Because I have a special assignment for you."
King Edmund leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Some of the lords who signed the treasonous petition are still at large.
I want you to hunt them down personally. Bring me their heads."
Marcus felt ice in his veins. "Their heads, sire?"
"As examples. To show everyone what happens to those who question royal authority."
The king smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Marcus had ever seen. "Start with Lady Catherine Ashworth. That little bitch has been causing trouble since her father died. I want her brought to me alive so I can execute her publicly." The words sealed King Edmund's fate. Marcus realized he was no longer looking at his sovereign, but at a monster wearing a crown.
"I understand, Your Majesty."
Marcus stood slowly, his hand closing around his dagger's hilt. King Edmund was still talking, outlining his plans for crushing the resistance, for expanding the war beyond the Northern Alliance, for ruling through fear and brutality. The blade slid between the king's ribs with surprising ease, finding his heart with the precision of 15 years of military training. King Edmund's eyes went wide with shock, then understanding, then something that might have been relief. "Why?" he whispered as his life ebbed away. Marcus knelt beside the dying man, supporting him as he had once supported wounded comrades on the battlefield. "Because I swore an oath to protect the kingdom," he said quietly. "And sometimes that means protecting it from its own king." King Edmund died with Marcus holding him, the weight of the crown finally lifted from his tormented shoulders. The aftermath moved quickly. Marcus raised no alarm, instead slipping out of the study and making his way to the castle's main hall. There he found the captain of the royal guard, a man named Stevens who had served faithfully but quietly questioned the king's recent orders. "Stevens," Marcus said calmly, "the king is dead. Princess Elena is en route to assume the throne. Will you support her claim?" Stevens stared at him for a long moment, processing the implications. "How?" "Heart attack," Marcus lied smoothly. The stress of recent events finally caught up with him. It was a fiction that Princess Elena would maintain, Marcus knew. The official story would be natural death, not regicide. It was cleaner that way, less likely to create martyrs or inspire revenge. Within hours, the news had spread throughout the capital. Princess Elena arrived before sunset, accompanied by Duke Harrison's son and several other nobles who had avoided arrest. She was crowned in an emergency ceremony that very evening, with the support of the surviving lords, most of the military command, and the increasingly vocal common people. Her first act as queen was to call off the planned invasion of the Northern Alliance territories. Her second was to release all political prisoners and begin negotiations for genuine peace with the neighboring kingdoms. Marcus was never officially credited with saving the kingdom. Officially, he was simply a loyal captain who had been present when his king died of natural causes. But Lady Catherine knew, and Princess Elena knew, and the men who had followed him into rebellion knew. That was enough. On a gray morning 6 months later, Marcus stood in the cemetery outside the capital, placing flowers on Lord Ashworth's grave. The headstone read simply, "A good man who died for peace." No mention of treason, no hint of the scandal that had consumed the kingdom. Lady Catherine appeared beside him, dressed in practical traveling clothes rather than court finery. "I'm leaving," she said without preamble. "Where will you go?" "North, to help with the reconstruction efforts. Queen Elena is sending aid to the villages that were damaged in the border conflicts. I want to be part of rebuilding instead of just remembering destruction." Marcus nodded. It was a good choice for her, a way to honor her father's memory through service rather than revenge. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you stay in the guard?" Marcus looked out over the peaceful cemetery, thinking about the choices that had brought him here. For now. Queen Elena needs people she can trust as she rebuilds the kingdom. Maybe someday I'll find a quiet farm somewhere and spend my days growing things instead of guarding them. "You saved the kingdom, you know," Lady Catherine said softly. "We all did. Your father, Duke Harrison, the common people who chose truth over comfort, the soldiers who chose conscience over orders. It wasn't any one person. But it started with you. With your choice to do what was right instead of what was easy." As Lady Catherine walked away, heading north toward her new life, Marcus remained among the graves. He thought about the king he'd killed, the war he'd prevented, the price of truth in a world built on lies. It had cost him his innocence, his simple faith in authority, his belief that following orders was always the right choice. But it had saved his kingdom and his soul. In the end, that seemed like a fair trade. The revolution was over. The real work of peace had just begun.